Okay, in this lecture, I'd like to show you how we can make a transition from critical thinking into inventive thinking. I told you there are two very important powers of the human mind. One is called critical thinking. That's what we've been working on. And critical thinking has to do with making judgments about other people's arguments, whether they be in the spoken or the written word. And the process, as I've been talking about, is translating from ordinary language into standard form, from standard form to abbreviated form, and test to try to put it into standard form categorical syllogism, test the syllogism by means of Venn diagrams and the rules, and determine whether or not the reasoning process is correct. If it is correct, then we ask ourselves, are the premises and the conclusion true? If so, then it's a sound argument and we can be persuaded and accept that argument. If not, then either it's invalid or unsound. We don't have to be persuaded by that argument. So that's called critical thinking. It's part of critical thinking. The other part is I call inventive thinking. And this is the part that I'm quite proud of. It dawned on me that we can reverse this process. Instead of going from ordinary language and losing all the nuance of meaning and trying to just extrapolate the structure of the argument in order to judge it, as we've been doing, that's what logic does. And it gets even more complicated. We can move into symbolic logic, which we haven't done yet, but it's contained in your book by Copy. So all that is judging arguments that are already made. But now we can reverse the process. If we know that there are 15 valid arguments, deductive arguments, namely syllogisms, and as we know by the coined named system for testing the validity, the moods and figures of these 15 valid syllogisms have been identified. And so if you look to page, in the 15th edition of Copy, on page 217, there's a list of the valid syllogisms. He also goes through each one and shows why each one is valid. And then at the end of the book too, there's a summary. You can find it at the end of the book. So there are these 15 valid syllogisms. 4 belong to figure 1, 4 belong to figure 2, 4 belong to figure 3, and 3 for figure 4. The vowels of those 15 names represent the mood and figure of those valid syllogisms. So Barbara, Celarent, Dari, and Ferio, the vowels of those make an AAA1, an EAE1, an AII1, or an EIO1. So in figure 1, where the middle term is on an angle, like the beginnings of a W, predicate terms always in the major premise, subject terms in the minor premise, and then subject and predicate term are in the conclusion. Well, here's what dawned on me. I think I shared this with you already, but this is what I want to work with you on now, and this is going to prepare you for your final project. Once you know that there are these 15 valid syllogisms, let's say you have a thesis that you want to develop. You want to give a speech, and there's this thesis. Let's say the thesis was you're going to give a talk to a group of people about voting, which is coming up in less than 40 days, I think, or 40 some days, which is a very important election. And you don't want to tell people how to vote, but you want to just illuminate them about what's important in voting. And so you're just going to, your thesis is, I would like to cast light on the voting process. And you want to leave it open so that you don't start telling people how to vote. So that's your thesis. It's quite an open-ended thesis. I just want to shed light on the voting process. And I think we should vote in such a way that we preserve the liberty and preserve this democratic republic that we live in. That's my thesis, let's say. So I want to construct some arguments that support that thesis. So the way you could go about doing that is just take a conclusion that you think supports that thesis, that we should vote in such a way that we preserve this democratic republic founded by the founders of our nation. That's my thesis. Let's say that's my thesis. Notice I'm not trying to tell anyone how to vote, Republican, Democrat, nothing. We should just vote in such a way that we preserve this democratic republic. Okay. Well, let's say, so one of the things that would support that, one can just come up with a conclusion, like only monarchs or kings are above the law. Okay. Now remember, when you translate that, if I say only monarch or a king is above the law, that translates into all those who are above the law are monarchs or kings. Remember we learned only and none but from chapter 7. The way we translate that is we reverse the subject and predicate terms. So all those who are above the law are monarchs or kings. So that would be my conclusion. Well, what dawned on me some time ago, a couple years ago, I realized that if I know these 15 valid syllogisms, and it'd be good to memorize them. I remember, it's not that hard. We memorize. I remember when I was your age, I memorized all the bones of the body, all the veins, everything. Especially when you're young, your mind is like a sponge. It shouldn't be that hard. Just make 4 groups, figure 1, 2, 3, 4. But you don't really have to do that for this class because it's all open book. But the advantage of memorizing that would be it frees your mind to, but you don't have to do it for this class. But if you memorize it, it frees your mind to be more creative. The creative process is quite different than anything else. Sometimes you have to sort of like, I work with a pencil, so you could like erase things, tweak things. It doesn't work this way, but it works this way. The creative process is a little more chaotic. You have to try things, and if it doesn't work, then you tweak it and you work something, or just have to throw out the whole idea and start something else. But it's not as complicated as it seems. And here's the process. You get a conclusion, like I was just saying, like only monarchs or kings are above the law. All right, so that translates into all those who are above the law are monarchs or kings. So you know that's an A proposition. All S is P, where S is those who are above the law, and P is monarchs or kings. Okay, people who are, we want to use, you have to make classes out of it. So people who are monarchs or kings, all right, or rulers who are monarchs or kings. Okay, so now we have our conclusion, but we have a lot more. That's what dawned on me. Because let's say if you have all S is P, and you know what S is, and you know what P is, where S is those who are above the law, and P is monarchs or rulers who are monarchs or kings, you have quite a bit. Because if you know that an AAA1, Barbara, the A is the first proposition, the major premise is the first A, and then the minor premise is the second A, and then the third A is the conclusion. The third letter of the mood is always the conclusion. Second letter is always the minor premise. And the first letter is always the major premise. And AAA, that's the mood of a syllogism. If it's in figure 1, where the M's are like the beginnings of a W, you have everything but the middle term. That was an epiphany for me, because I could generalize a lot from that. Because look, you have everything, except you don't know what M is yet. Now you have to use your ingenuity for that. Ingenuity is the power of the mind that can perceive, not visually perceive, but mentally perceive similarities in disparate things. All great thinkers have enormous powers of ingenuity. And I believe that ingenuity is the basis of wisdom, because wisdom has to do with the whole. And if you don't see similarities, you can't see the whole. Whether it's speculative wisdom, the whole story of existence, divine and human, practical wisdom, the whole situation that you find yourself in, or the whole truth, it's still the whole, the 3 different kinds of wholes, but the whole nonetheless. In order to see the whole, you need ingenuity. So ingenuity is this power of the mind that sees similarities in disparate things. So the middle term, in order to find that middle term, you need to use your ingenuity. So, but if you have your conclusion and you have your AAA1, I don't know if it's an AAA1. You see, what the way I go about this is you get the conclusion and then find there's 15 syllogisms. Find all the ones that end in A, because that A is going to be your conclusion. So AAA1, actually with the A, that's a unique one, because the only one that ends in A is Barbara, AAA1. So if I want to make an A proposition be the conclusion, and I want to make a valid syllogism, it has to be an AAA, because there's only one. With the others, there's a lot. There's a lot of, you can count how many there are. The ones that end in E, the ones that end in I, the ones that end in O. So you just try it. So you get your conclusion, you turn it into an A, E, I, or an O proposition. In this case, we turned it into an A. And then you look to the 15 syllogisms. Actually, part of this process is quite mechanical. And then part of it, you have to use your ingenuity. But you look to the conclusion, you find the A, and now you have everything but the middle term, because you have all M. You don't know what this M is yet, but you know it's all something because it's an A. The major premise has to be an A in an AAA1, right? All M is, and you have your P, monarchs or kings. So you write that down. Just put M there because you don't know what that is yet. All something or other. I'm trying to take you through the inventive process. So all something or other, you don't know what it is yet. That's going to be an M. Is a monarch or a king. Okay, so write that down. All M is a monarch or a king, because you know it's a monarch or a king because that's the predicate term of your conclusion. So you got that. And then in your minor premise, you have your subject term, those who are above the law. So all those who are above the law, that's your subject term, is M. You don't know what that M is yet. Now you have everything except for the middle term. All M is a monarch or a king. All those who are above the law are M's, whatever that is. You don't know what that is yet. We're trying to generate that. Therefore, all those who are above the law are monarchs or kings. So now you have to use your ingenuity and think, how can I connect the predicate and subject term together? Well, I had to think for that and come up with something. So I thought, well, all rulers who have absolute control over their subjects. Let's try that. Let's plug that into the M and see if it works. So now let's read the whole syllogism. All rulers who have absolute control over their subjects are monarchs or kings. That sounds pretty good. Then you go to the minor premise. All those who are above the law, we already have that from our conclusion, now we try our middle term, rulers who have absolute control over their subjects. Therefore, only those who are above the law are monarchs or kings. So the whole thing sounds like this. All rulers who have absolute control over their subjects are monarchs or kings. All those who are above the law are rulers who have absolute control over their subjects. Therefore, all those who are above the law are monarchs or kings. Now I got a syllogism. All M is P, all S is M, all S is P. I call that abbreviated form because I'm bracketing monarchs, kings, above the law, whatever. You got an AAA1. And then you can test the validity. I already did that already. So there, you have it. Now that would substantiate a talk, because we don't want to vote for anyone who thinks they're above the law, because that person is a monarch or a king. But we don't live in a monarchy or a principality, a kingdom. We live in a democratic republic. Okay, so notice, I'm not trying to tell anybody how to vote. I'm just saying, if you vote, be careful that you don't vote for somebody who thinks they're above the law, because that's a person who doesn't understand what a democratic republic is. Do you see how, and this could be a little more persuasive than just like getting behind some campaign and calling the other side names and doing dirty work. Notice I'm being philosophical. I'm going back to the history, Republican political theory. I'm trying to illuminate the people about what it means to live in a republic. And when you vote, be sure to preserve our republic. That's what's most important. And it has nothing to do with being a Democrat or Republican. It has to do with preserving the republic. All right, so let's stay with that same thesis. It's on my mind now because I've been watching the news perhaps too much, actually. I need to back off a little bit. But so given this important election coming up, I was thinking politically. So let's try another one now. Let's try another one that would support that same thesis. So you want to have the same thesis, and you're going to, oh, there's one more step I didn't tell you about. But so when you present that in the form of a speech, you take that and try to put it into fluid prose. I call it rhetorical language. You try to speak eloquently. And the way you do that, and this is not part of this course, but you study the history of classical rhetoric and listen to great speeches, listen how people speak, and then emulate that style. You can use the style. But the other thing I want to share with you is you can take chapter 7 and invert it. So remember in chapter 7, we learned how to go from ordinary language standard into standard form. Now we're starting with standard form. We got our formal syllogism. We know it's valid. Now you can take chapter 7 and use it, reverse the process. Instead of using the same 3 terms, you can use synonyms. You can reverse the process. Instead of saying, all those who are above the law are monarchs or kings, you can say only monarchs or kings are above the law. That sounds better, right? It flows better. So when you translate this is the bare bones. I call this the skeleton. This is the logical skeleton. Okay, and then you take that logical skeleton and you enflesh it. You put it into flesh and blood. Let it be a living being. Let it have a body, and let the parts all fit together like a human body. And let there be transition. Let it flow eloquently. That takes time. That's not part of this course, but you learn how to create transition. You learn how to use metaphor, simile, alliteration. And this is the subject matter of classical rhetoric. But you can just put it into good prose for now. I'm not going to grade you on how eloquent your speeches are, but the more eloquent it is, and the more persuasive it will be. But let's do a few more. Now, let's try one that ends in an O, an I mean. So let's say some presidents are persons who consider themselves above the law. And notice I didn't mention the president, but there are some presidents who think they're above the law because we can't control how a president thinks, right? You can still be a president and think you're above the law. All right, so that's an I proposition. So you just go through your list of the 15 valid syllogisms, find out which ones end in I. Well, there's one, AII1, Dari, that's one. Another one is AII3, Datisti. There's IAI3 and IAI4. So you just try these. So I tried an AII3, Datisi. DA is the major premise. I is the minor premise. And the last I is the conclusion. Some presidents are above the law. So I have some S is P. And I know S is presidents and P are persons who consider, I almost said Putin, that's a Freudian slip. Persons who consider themselves above the law. Not Putin's, persons. Bad joke. All right, so persons who consider themselves above the law, that's the predicate term. So now, if you want to try it, we got to try things when we're being creative. So AII 3. So you have to know that, the more you have memorized, the better, right? So I know a 3 is when the major the major term, the middle term is on the left-hand side. And I know that the predicate term has to be in the major premise and the subject term has to be in the minor premise. So I have everything except the middle term again. As soon as you have your, here's what dawned on me and gave me my epiphany. As soon as you have your conclusion, you have everything. Given the fact that we know these 15 valid syllogisms, you have everything but the middle term. Now you just have to use your ingenuity, try to come up with the middle term. Once you got your middle term, boom, you have a syllogism. Now you try to make it true, everything true, then you have sound syllogism. Then if you can translate that into good prose, then you have something. Actually, it's exciting for me. I don't know why this excites me so much, but you have a valid syllogism that's sound. No one can touch that. No one can touch. I mean, they can say it's a bunch of, but it won't mean anything, because if they accept the truth of the premises, they have to accept the truth of the conclusion. It's like an iron trap. So that's what's so wonderful about the syllogism. All right, so I have my conclusion. Some presidents are persons who consider themselves above the law. And I know I want to make an AII3. So I know the first premise has to be an A premise. Well, I don't know what the major middle term is yet. You never know the middle term until you get, so I put everything there except for the middle term and then just read it and then use your ingenuity to come up with the middle term. So you have all M, you don't know what M is yet, is P. You know what P is because P is the predicate term of your conclusion, persons who consider themselves to be above the law. So you have all M is a person who considers themselves to be above the law. Now you know the minor premise has to be an I because we're working on an AII3. So the second I is the minor premise. So you have all, and you know the M has to be in the first position because it's in figure 3. So you have some M, we don't know what the M is yet, is a president. So then read the whole thing together and then try to come up with the middle term. This is the creative part of it all. All M is a person who considers themselves to be above the law. Some M is a president. Therefore, some presidents are persons who consider themselves to be above the law. So now we need the middle term. Well, sometimes, so what dawned on me as I explored and used my ingenuity was autocratic rulers. At first I put dictators, but then I knew about dictators from my study of Roman Republic. A dictator, properly speaking, see the Romans came up with the idea of a dictator. A dictator means 10 years. So when things get really chaotic, then somebody comes in for 10 years and takes total control over the republic. But then after those 10 years, they have to leave. So but the word dictator has taken on pejorative meaning in later times. But it didn't mean, it's not a bad thing. So, and then I tried the word dictator and it didn't work very well. So then I softened it a little bit. I turned it into autocratic rulers. Auto means self and cratic means to rule. So people who, all autocratic rulers, that's a word that's being thrown around a lot in political discourse these days. And then it worked. So now I have my syllogism. All autocratic rulers are persons who consider themselves to be above the law. Some autocratic rulers, that's your middle term, are presidents. Therefore, some presidents are persons who consider themselves to be above the law. So I have my AII3. Datisi is and then you can test the validity. You don't have to test it really, but that's how it looks when you test it. And now you have a valid syllogism and it supports that thesis that when you vote, please try to vote in such a way that you preserve our democratic republic. Okay, so let's try one that ends in E. I'm still playing around with this idea of being above the law. Let's say I want to say no person living in a republic is a person who is above the law. So that's an E proposition, and that's going to be my conclusion. So then I just go through my list, I find all the ones that end in E. So there's EAE1. Let's try that. if it didn't work, we'll try another one that ends in E. You just have to try one. So let's try Syllarant, then EAE1. So if you have your conclusion, then you have everything but your middle term. And you know the one has to be with the middle terms, like in a W, like the beginnings of a W. So if I say no person living in a republic is a person who is above the law. Person living in a republic is the subject of my conclusion. And a person who is above the law, that's my predicate. And I know it has to be an EAE, so the first one has to be no, and I know that first term has to be M, but I don't know what that M is yet because I'm involved in the creative process. No M is a person who is above the law. That's my predicate term, and that's going to go in my major premise. All persons living in a republic, that's going to be my minor premise, has to be an A proposition because we're making an EAE one, right? Second premise is the minor premise, that's an A. All, and we know what that subject term is, and it is persons living in a republic. But we don't know what the middle term is. And then, so you put all that down and then just read it out loud to yourself and try to come up with the middle term. This is the creative moment. So no M, we don't know what the M is yet, is a person who is above the law. All persons living in a republic are M. Therefore, no person living in a republic is a person who is above the law. Well, one thing that would work is a person afforded self-government. I happen to, in our Constitution, when they say of the people, by the people, for the people, see, we live in a democratic republic, which is really emphasizing the people. When our founding fathers made our nation, the foundations of our nation, they were breaking from England, which was a monarchy. We call that a principality or a monarchy. And so they really wanted to put the rule into the hands of the people. That's why it's really important for us to have critical thinking so we can know how to rule ourselves. Otherwise, it's like giving the kids, the rule of the mob. That's what the alt-right, like to say about the liberals, that it's just mob rule, so then it can be actually mob rule if you don't have an intelligent, educated populace. Well, so self-government in our Constitution, we both words, democratic and republic, emphasize the people. So of the people, by the people, for the people, they really wanted to emphasize self-government. Self-government means we rule ourselves, that we are the government. Okay, because the opposite of that is the monarchy or principality or fascism or, okay, so a person afforded self-government could be the middle term. No person afforded self-government is a person who is above the law. This one I probably would tweak. This one is not as good as the others, but I'm just trying to illustrate the process. So M is a person afforded self-government. Let's try that. No person afforded self-government is P, a person who is above the law. All persons living in a republic, that's my minor premise, is M. All S is M. That is, all persons living in a republic are persons afforded self-government. Therefore, no person living in a republic is a person who is above the law. So that's an EAE1 Syllarant, and it looks like that, and it's valid. That one I'm not real happy about. I'd probably work on that middle term a little bit better, but I'm just trying to illustrate the process for you now. All right, let's do one more, and then I'll just summarize the process one more time for you. It's quite mechanical. I mean, it's not mechanical in the sense, by mechanical I mean you just follow the rules. But the creative part is you come up with a thesis. That's important. Something you want to support. Like this one, I think if I were delivering a talk to voters, I would say, listen, I'm not going to tell you how to vote, because I don't believe that that's my position. But I have studied the history of Republican political theory, and I know that we live in a democratic republic. So however you vote, please vote in such a way that you try to preserve our democratic republic. That would be my thesis. And it's a little more persuasive that way than trying to tell people how to vote. I mean, especially this debates, it's going to be just mudslinging, negative campaigning. People, they're going to break all those fallacies we've studied, and that goes out the window. It's just name calling. Whoever can attack, the best. Biden might not do it as much as Trump, but Trump, he's been doing that for 4 years, right? Just calling people names. Right? All right, so all this logic is going to go out the window when you watch the debate. That'd be interesting watching the debates. And just since you know those fallacies, you guys did a really good job on the informal fallacies. Just mark all the fallacies you see. You're going to see just about everything that comes out of their mouth will be fallacious. All right, let's do one more. Let's say we wanted to find one with an E, but a different mood. So let's say my conclusion is no nation that celebrates liberty for all is a nation that tolerates systemic racism. I moved into racism a little bit because that's another issue that's big. The three big issues, are the pandemic, racism, and the well, there's four actually for me. The environment's really, and for you people, you young people, I heard that the polls are saying you guys are concerned about that. Actually, you should be. You're going to be living in this world a lot longer than I am now, and the older people. And there's no doubt that there's an environmental crisis. Anybody that denies that is just denying the whole scientific community. So there are four big issues that you guys face, that we all face: the pandemic, the economic situation, and the systemic racism, and the environmental crisis. These are four big issues. So let's say I want to say no nation that celebrates liberty for all, that's our nation, right, is a nation that tolerates systemic racism. That's a hard idea for people to get a hold of. Anything systemic, they don't know. Most people don't even know what that means, actually. It means that it's embedded in the very way we treat each other, and the very way laws are enacted and made and put into practice in such a way that you don't even see it, but the statistics say it clearly. So that's called system. Anything that's systemic takes a little more thought to understand. I mean, there's corruption, right? Like there can be a police department that's corrupt, where people are on the take and things. Corruption is one thing, but then the corruption can go so deep that the system itself is corrupt. So that needs a revision of the whole system. That's systemic racism. All right, so no nation that celebrates liberty for all is a nation that can tolerate systemic racism. No nation that celebrates liberty for all is a nation that tolerates systemic racism. So it's an E proposition. No S is P, where S is a nation that celebrates liberty for all, and P is a nation that tolerates systemic racism. So I go through my 15 syllogisms. I find one that ends in E, and just try it. Well, once you have your conclusion, and you know it's in, let's try AEE4. It's chemistries. No, oh no, let's see. Kameni's. AEE4, yeah. Kameni's. Kameni's. AEE, and it's figure 4. Okay, so I have my conclusion, no SSP. No nation that celebrates liberty for all is a nation that tolerates systemic racism. So I know it's figure 4, So I know that the M's have to be like the last part of a W. And I know that the P has to be in the major premise, the S has to be in the minor premise. And I know what P and S are. So I have everything except for the middle term. That was my big epiphany. I have everything. Once you have your conclusion and you have the structure of a valid syllogism, you have everything except for the middle term. Now you have to use your ingenuity. All right, so I have an A proposition for my major premise. All nations that tolerate systemic racism are, and now I don't know what this M is yet. And then I know my minor premise has to be an E proposition because it's an AEE4. So no M, I don't know what this M is yet, is a nation that can celebrate liberty for all. So now I have to think about what this middle term is. How can I connect the subject to the predicate term? How can I mediate in order to make that inference? I know the conclusion, I know the subject and predicate term. And, well, I was listening to the news the other day. This professor, I forgot his name. I didn't put his name into my memory, but I was going to look it up. He wrote a book on fascism, and he claims he's a professor of philosophy from Yale. And if you're a professor of philosophy at Yale, you've done your homework and you publish books and you just don't get a position like that. Okay, so it's a bona fide book. And they were interviewing him and he was saying, we don't live in a fascist regime, but the mechanics are there for fascism. And so, I perked up my ears. I was thinking about getting the book and looking at it. Like he has 10 elements of fascism. Like one is to go back to this golden age of the past, like Mussolini did that. Like we'll go back to the Roman imperial Rome, like make America great again. And unreality is another one. And there's 10. He has 10 chapters in each. So there can be mechanisms of fascism without living in a fascist regime. Fascism is a complete dictator regime, like Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and Stalin. These are fascist regimes. So they asked this guy, do you think we're living in a fascism? He says, no, it's not fascism yet, but the mechanisms are there in place. So we have to be careful because democracy is fragile. So let's take a chance and try fascist regime and see how it works. All nations that tolerate systemic racism, brings to mind Hitler and the Jews and the Gypsies. Hitler exterminated more than 6 million. The Jews were 6 million. If you add the Gypsies and gay people and people with mental disabilities and so on, there are like 12 million. So that's racism, right? All nations that tolerate systemic racism are fascist regimes. Now I have my middle term, fascist regime. I could soften that a little bit, maybe. To make it, like if I were really going to present this to people, I wouldn't call it a fascist regime. The mechanisms of fascism are in place. Are regimes in which the mechanism of fascism is in place. I would probably soften it just a little. Sometimes you have to soften things or make it harder, stronger. Soft and hard are like important words. They can be metaphors, like hard is yang and soft is yin and yang. It should balance it. But in some cases, fascist regime, let's just use that for now, but probably the mechanisms of fascism might be a little softer, a little more persuasive. So all nations that tolerate systemic racism are fascist, are nations that in which the mechanisms of fascism are in place. There, I can say it like that. No nation in which the mechanisms of fascism are in place are nations that can tolerate, are nations that can celebrate liberty for all. Therefore, no nation that celebrates liberty for all is a nation that can tolerate systemic racism. See, that's a good one. I like that one. That's better than the last one. Okay, so now I have a skeleton of a syllogism. And I think, I mean, after I've softened that the middle term, I think the premises and the conclusions are true from what I know about politics. So now I have a sound, I think I have a sound syllogism. But no, so this is the process. I went over 4 for you. So that's an AEE4. And, you know, it looks like this once you, you know, diagram it, and it's valid. Now, if I translate that into good prose, I have. So this is the process. You have a thesis that you want to support. And this is important. This helped me. Try to put your thesis into one sentence. If you can do that, that's good, because one sentence has integrity. It holds together. So then that means, and then make sure that all the arguments that you create, that you invent, support that thesis. So that when you're finished, your listener is clear about what you said. What you said was this thesis. And all these arguments that you just, these 4 arguments that I just generated in skeleton form, support that thesis, that when you vote, try to vote in such a way that you preserve a democratic republic. And if you think that's Biden, if you think it's whether you're voting for the president or senator, whatever, or the treasurer or the judges, whatever, judge and that's my thesis. Okay. So the way, how did I do that? I came up with a thesis and I put that down. I have it clear in my mind. Now I just make a claim that supports that thesis, a conclusion. Then turn that conclusion into an A, E, I, or an O proposition. Now that's going to be the last letter of the mood of your syllogism. And then you have these 15 valid syllogisms on page 217. And then again, at the back of the book, they have a little summary of all the important things. They show them again. And he goes through them one by one, also explains each one. There are 15 valid syllogisms. You don't have to go through the deduction of the 50. That's we don't have to do that for that. He deduces that why these are the 15 valid ones. And I mean, that's for meta logic, and we don't need to go through that now. I'm not going to ask you to do that. Okay, so you get your conclusion, you turn it into an A, E, I, or an O proposition. And once you have it into an A, E, I, or an O, then you look to the last letter of those 15 valid syllogisms and pick one that ends in an O or an E, an I, or A. And then if you have your conclusion and you have your subject and predicate term of your conclusion, then you put your predicate and subject terms up there, put the middle terms where they have to be, given that figure, whatever figure it is. And then you know it's A, E, I. You know that the major-minded premise has to be an A, E, I, or an O, because you know the mood, you know the figure. So then put it all down and then just read it out loud and then try to find the middle term. Once you get your middle term, boom, you got it. Now you just have to translate that into ordinary language. Just take that and just say it. But, you know, use premise indicators, conclusion indicators, like or you can use chapter 7, use synonyms. You know, you can take things and make it fluid, make it flow. Use metaphors, you can use rhetorical questions. There's one, you know, you can use a rhetorical question that really is a statement. You know, you guys all know what a rhetorical question is. And that could be your conclusion. Okay. All right. So I hope that illustrates that process. The same thing can be done with symbolic logic too. I want to explore that, you know, maybe later, not for this class, but for a more advanced class. One could instantiate. So what we're doing is instantiating. We're going, instead of from form to content, instead of content to form, we're going from form to content. We're going from these valid structures. So what I want you to do is learn how to create the skeleton of valid syllogisms that support a thesis. And then take one more step and translate that into ordinary language. So take chapter 7 and invert that process. Instead of going from content to form. We're going from form to content. All right, that's the plan.